Good morning, dear student of class 11. Today I am going to teach you snapshots of your lesson. The second lesson, the address, written by Marga Minko. The second lesson of your snapshots from your syllabus. The address is a poignant account of a daughter who goes in search of her mother's belongings after the war in Holland. It revolves around the young daughter of Mrs. H, who in good faith allows of her old-time friend Mrs. Darling to carry away all the table silver and precious old things to her own house for safekeeping. The narrator during her first homecoming notices many things missing. When she comes back home a second time, she sees Mrs. Darling taking away her heavy suitcase. She is also told by her mother to remember the address of Mrs. Darling. After the liberation, normalcy returns. The narrator feels like seeing and touching her things. She goes to Marconi Street address to see Mrs. Darling. There she gets a very cold reception from her and is not allowed to come inside. When she goes there the second time, Mrs. Darling's daughter invites her in. The narrator is sad to see all her mother's precious articles kept in the untidy room in tasteless manner. Then she decides not to recover them. She even resolves to forget the address. The story tells how we affect the lives of civilians as well. It disturbs the normal life and leads to conflicts and tension. The narrator loses her interest in her old stuff because they evoke the memories of her former life and make her nostalgic. Then you go to the summary of the lesson. Holland was fighting for independence. The narrator had joined the forces. It was a long drawn and deadly war. Success seemed a far cry. The people doubted if any of the soldiers would return alive. The narrator had only her mother, Mrs. S, at home. Her mother was worried about the safety of her belongings. She had a lot of silver cutlery and antiques. One day an old acquaintance of hers turned up unexpectedly. She was Mrs. Darling. She won the confidence of Mrs. H and offered to take away Mrs. A's precious things to her own home for safekeeping, and Mrs. A's accepted the offer thankfully. The narrator was home for a few days during the first half of the war. She noticed the change in the room. She missed several things. She surprised the mother by her keen observation. It was then that Mrs. Ace told her about Mrs. Darling, who had kindly taken away all the tables, silver, vases, antiques, plates, crockery. Mrs. Darling promised to keep all those nice things safely. Mrs. Ace, however, did not get an assurance that those things were returnable. Next morning, Mrs. Darling turned up again. This broad-backed woman was taking away the heavy suitcase stuffed with things. The mother introduced the narrator to Mrs. Darling. It was the first time the girl had met her. Mrs. Darling lived in Marconi Street, house number 46. The mother told the daughter to remember the address, and she did remember it for a long time. After the war of liberation had come to an end, the narrator returned to her city. Gradually, everything became more normal again, and one day the narrator was reminded of all her possessions. The mother was no more alive. She was alone, living in a single room. There was no space to recover all those things that keep them in the room. Still, she wanted to see them and touch them once. So she travelled by train to Marconi Street and rang the doorbell of house number 46. A woman opened the door partly through the narrow opening. She studied the visitor. She was Mrs. Downing herself. She had not expected the girl to come back home alive. She refused to recognize the visitor. The narrator for a while wondered if she had come to the wrong place. But her doubt was removed when she was Mrs. Downing wearing her mother's green knitted cardigan. So she had come to the right address. Mrs. Dowling could not help asking how she alone had survived the war. She refused to let the visitor into the house. She closed the door also. The narrator looked at the nameplate again. It said Dowling, number 46. She walked back to the station and was lost in the memories of the things. Her first visit to Mrs. Dowling's house was in vain, but she did not accept it. She decided to try a second time. This time, Mrs. Dowling's 15-year-old daughter opened the door. Mrs. Dowling was not at home. The narrator decided to wait. She followed the girl along the passage. She was her heavy candle holders hung next to a mirror. She was taken to the living room. She found arranged in tasteless way. The furniture was ugly and the air was damp smelling. She sat down at a table and noticed that the tablecloth was hers. It had a burn mark to the edge, left unrepaired by her mother. The girl said her mother would be back soon, and she had already made tea for her. The girl offered a cup to the visitor as well. She opened a box and took some spoons out. All those things were a part of the narrator's mother's belongings. She realized that one got so very used to things that one did not notice them intently. Mrs. Dowling's daughter also never noticed that the cutlery she used every day was silver. She opened a drawer to bring out more spoons and forks, but the narrator did not wait to see them. She did not want to meet Mrs. Dowling, so she jumped up to go to catch her train. At the corner of the road, she looked up at the nameplate. The address was correct, but she did not want to remember it anymore. She had no intention to visit that house again. She had lost interest in the things that had been taken away from her house and put in strange surroundings. Moreover, she had no need of them in her all small rented room. Only a handful of cutlery fitted into the narrow table drawer. So she made up her mind to forget that address forever, and it was quite easy to do now. Dear student, it is your second lesson in snapshots. The address written by Marga Minko. Tomorrow I will continue the question and answers of this lesson. Thank you, student, and goodbye.